Welcome everyone to the Community IT webinar. This one is Making IT Governance Work for Your Nonprofit. So today we're going to be addressing some questions that seem fairly simple. What IT policies do you need? And what are the best ways to create them? How do you roll them out to staff? And are there barriers that are keeping you from doing this project? And we know that if creating or updating these policies were simple, we wouldn't have to have this panel discussion today with our experts. We would all already have our policies. So if you are feeling paralyzed about starting the project to create or revise your policy, our experts today are going to take questions on where to find nonprofit IT policy templates, how to overcome these barriers and modify the templates to your organizational needs and your strategic goals, and how to get your stakeholders on board and roll out training on new policies to all of your staff. My name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm the Outreach Director for Community IT and the moderator today. And I'm very happy to hear from our guest speakers, Jeff Gibson from Build Consulting and Nura Aboki from Community IT. But first, I'm going to go over our learning objectives today. So by the end of today, we hope you'll be able to discuss essential IT policy documentation for nonprofits and what should be prioritized, learn how to create or update these IT governance policies, and share templates. We're going to share templates. I will share templates with you. And if you know of a good template, you can share that in chat also. Learn tactics and strategies to roll out policies to all of your staff and understand barriers to implementing IT governance and how to overcome those barriers. So now I'd like to turn it over to our panel to introduce themselves. Jeff, would you like to go first and also tell us about Build Consulting?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Jeff Gibson. I'm with Build Consulting. I've spent about the last 25 years in the nonprofit and private sector, focusing primarily on analytics and implementing those results into an operational model that's manageable. Trying to take the theory out of things like governance and putting them into practical applications. Build Consulting is a consultancy focused on exclusively with nonprofits, and we are very highly agnostic to vendor or other partnerships. We focus on the strategy and the sort of approach to technology, project leadership, change management. We tend to focus on the situation rather than the technology and what managing change management from an organizational perspective, and then relating it to the technology itself. A large variety of consultants with very diverse subject matter expertise, and we can pretty much find someone that has a deep knowledge base for any problem you might run into. I'm happy to be here, by the way.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here too, Jeff. It's the first time for Jeff on the webinar, but hopefully not the last. Yes, I think we did a webinar with Build a while back, and something struck with me that you often say, which is the technology decisions should be last. That when you're thinking about the problem you're trying to solve, there's a whole bunch of work that comes first before you choose which platform or tool you're going to go with. And I just love that approach. Nura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nura Aboki, community IT consultant here. I've been with community IT for about 15 years, helping clients with their IT management strategies, IT planning, budgeting, IT road mapping of their network infrastructure, as well as working on developing IT policies for our nonprofit clients. Over the past 15 years, I've seen quite an evolution in this management of IT infrastructure from on-premises to the cloud. So I'm really excited here to talk about governance, IT governance in general, and how it's been quite interesting watching our clients over the past 15 years.
Yes, I feel like we've said for maybe a couple of years now, that we should do a webinar on governance. Because we always say governance is so important, and those policies are just the bedrock of what you're going to do with IT. But I'm really happy that we're finally doing it. So before we begin, if you're not familiar with Community IT, I'm going to tell you a little bit about us. We are a 100% employee-owned managed services provider. We provide outsourced IT support exclusively to nonprofit organizations And our mission is to help nonprofits accomplish their missions through the effective use of technology. We are big fans of what well-managed IT can do for your nonprofit. We serve nonprofits across the United States. We've been doing this for over 20 years, and we are technology experts. We're consistently given the MSP 501 recognition for being a top MSP, and that's an honor we received again in 2023. So I want to remind everyone for these presentations, Community IT is vendor agnostic. So we only make recommendations to our clients and only based on their specific business needs. So we never try to get a client into a product because we get an incentive or benefit from that. But we do consider ourselves a best of breed IT provider. So it's our job to know the landscape, what tools are available, reputable, and widely used. And we make recommendations on that basis for our clients based on their business needs, priorities, and budget. And now we would like to go on to our first poll. All right, so the question is, does your organization have an acceptable use policy? And the options to answer are yes, and we know how to use it. Yes, but we don't really use it. Not sure. No, not yet. Or not applicable or other. So we know we have lots of different people on the presentation from different types of nonprofits, large ones, small ones. So you're here for a presentation about creating policies. And that's the kind of the question. So do you know if you have this particular policy, the acceptable use policy, and do you also use it? Nura, can you see the answer?
Yes, I can see the responses here. And
Great. Could you read those for us?
yes, about 38% said they have it, but they don't really use it. And about, let's say, 23% said not yet. So there's seems to be organizations that wanting to start. Some are not sure. Then followed by the ones that have it and we know how to use it, which is quite impressive. By 8 people responded to that. And then lastly, there's one person that it's not applicable or other.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for sharing that with us. There's no shame, right? You're in the right place. If you don't have one or you're not sure, that's what this webinar is about. All right, so our first topic, which kind of I think is a great segue into our first topic, is to explain what are the essential IT policy documents nonprofits need to have and why. What are the priorities if you have to start with one before the other? So Jeff, would you like to weigh in on some of these policies that we've put up here on this slide?
Absolutely. I mean, the biggest ones are the obvious ones, the disaster recovery and data retention. Those are becoming, obvious, but there may be something in particular to your type of organization that you have to prioritize other things. AI is also, depending on the usage internally, could be promoted to the top of that list, depending on what your situation is. Data retention probably is the newest leader in that game because of the lowered cost of lowered point of entry for AI tools and malicious actors. The data repositories tend to make a pretty big target for a malicious actor. But it is particularly your organization, but the obvious ones I think are data security and the overall organizational disaster recovery.
Nura, I know we often say that acceptable use policy that we just asked about is one of the bedrock policies that you should have. Can you talk a little bit about what is that for anyone who doesn't know?
Yeah, so it is the foundation of most IT organizations' IT policy. Acceptable use is their foundation policy, a basic policy that governs what staff is allowed to do and not allowed to do with their devices and software. And it usually defines the use of equipment, computing services, and lays out security expectations. Organizations that are thinking of IT policy, thinking that it may be challenging or they don't have resources. One quick one to actually roll out, and there are several templates out there, which I know resources can be shared during this webinar, is that the acceptable use policy is one way to start, because that's the policy that impacts the staff most immediately. If you provide devices to them, then they need to know what to do with those devices, the applications that they use at work. They need to know the the applications for productivity, and if there's any room for other applications, or maybe it's quite strict and there's no room to use any other application. So those are, I think that is the one that we call the bedrock, but it's definitely foundational for all organizations. Along that, there is BYOD, or bring your own device. Some organizations allow for staff to bring their own device to work, and having a policy around the use of that BYOD device and applications is can go alongside with the acceptable use policy.
I want to move on to the process. So we just published a blog post about a bunch of different types of policies and links to some templates that you can use, including some that are on our site and examples. But once you know that you need an acceptable use policy, for example, or a disaster recovery policy or a data retention policy, what's the process? How do you identify the stakeholders and make them part of the process? Is your policy strategic? Is it tactical? And how do you create an implementation plan? And if you already have a policy, are there different steps that you might take? So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeff. Do you want to talk a little bit about being successful at a process to develop or revise your policies?
Absolutely. One of the things, the easy identification would be any group that holds, uses, or retains data, whether that's end user data, customer data, constituent data. Those folks have to have a meaningful bit of input into how data is stored and accessed, and what sort of what data they need to have access to, and what data can be manipulated. They also need to have, if possible, get buy-in and sign off on your draft policies, especially the data retention policies. It's also critical. One that gets forgotten a lot is data sharing policies. What do different departments share with outside vendors? That frequently gets lost in the shuffle. And really, an organization that does share a fair amount of user data, constituent data for outside vendor analytics or whatever, they really need to craft at least a policy for the vendor to sign once they've been thoroughly vetted. Data destruction, data sharing with their particular partners, et cetera. That one gets missed a lot, but is critical, because once that data leaves your organization, you have no control over what occurs with it. The one hiccup, and I saw in some of the questions before that came in before the webinar, how to get buy-in. Of course, getting buy-in from leadership is one of the toughest things to do, and getting leadership to prioritize your ever-shrinking timeframes to actually craft these policies. One trick I've used in the past is sort of risk analysis. Putting it into terms that non-technical leadership will understand. Here's GDPR is a great example. The first fine associated with a GDPR violation could be as much as $40,000, and most organizations can't take that hit, and those are by incident fines. So framing it like that, rather than giving a technical explanation, or here's the risk to the organization, here's the financial risk, here's the risk to our continued operations. Those are good ways to get buy-in. And then once you do garner that buy-in, or even if it's partial, always encourage the leadership to be sort of consistent and persistent in their messaging to the larger staff. 3 months into this project, they're going to need that refresher, like, hey, VP X is very into this, and we have to do this for the security organization. So we need you to prioritize this within your own department, your own team, or within your own timeline. It's hard. It's never easy, but again, framing it in a way that non-technical folks will understand.
That's great advice. Nura, can you talk a little bit more about forming that team? Do you always need to have someone from the executive team as part of the leadership driving the process forward to create the policy or revise it?
Yeah, I think it's important to have executive buy-in in terms of stakeholders, management team, executive team, and also the board. If you have a board, You could have an exec or governance committee in the board, and that governance committee could have influence to effectively kind of convince the executive team to work on this, making it a priority. So I like Jeff's, kind of tactics and approach with using the risks analysis to get buy-in, as well as getting stakeholders from from across the organization, so you can have a spectrum of perspective. You want your policy to be as holistic as possible. I think taking a few steps back, more and more we are seeing the need arising from cyber liability insurance applications. That if you want to get coverage, you have to have certain policies in place. More importantly, for nonprofit organizations, some funders require certain IT policies and IT governance policies to be in place. So those are key drivers of convincing executive team to actually create the time to make this a priority.
Thank you so much for that. I want to get into this bullet here that we talked about earlier when we were preparing for this webinar around strategic or tactical policies, and if that impacts who needs to be involved leading the process. So I suppose a more tactical policy might be some of the things you were talking about, Jeff, around the vendor, like you needing to interact with the vendor in a certain way, so having to have a policy around that, versus perhaps the acceptable use policy is a more strategic, high level, this is kind of a blanket policy of how we're going to go forward. Jeff, do you have some more ideas on a process when it is a tactical policy need of how to get those stakeholders engaged? And it might be per vendor or per platform. Is that
Right.
true?
Yeah, I think part of it, I mean, I would almost argue that every policy needs to be tactical in some respect, because one thing that does get short shrift is we made this policy, it's beautiful, everybody signed off on it. It was a lot of work, but we're all happy we got it done, and then it becomes shelfware. How do we implement these policies? How are the users who need to execute or escalate on a policy infringement? What do they do next? What are their next steps? How do we, if there was a DR incident, again, I ran operations for the last 20 years, and you'd be surprised that no matter how much we craft the DR policy, the actual execution, that the first 3-hour execution, that's critical to the success or failure of your plan. But a lot of folks don't get trained on it, even within IT organizations. So with something like GDPR, you have 72 hours to resolve the issue. If the person in your development department doesn't know anything about GDPR or our process or whatever, that could be a problem. The strategic stuff, that can be prioritized based on the strategic plan of the organization, and you can weight things within your prioritization process for projects, et cetera. But on the tactical front, especially things like COVID, things like changes in legislation, GBLA, or the California Privacy Act, or those have sort of forced a lot of these things to be of greater import. Formerly back burner, relatively safe back burner policy issues are now at the forefront because of right to be forgotten laws across the globe. Turning it into tactical, you have to, with leadership, you have to have that conversation that tactical resources need to be applied to this, and Project X is now suddenly very important because of state, local, federal compliance issues, or a new compliance issue related to our industry or our space. Therefore, explaining to leadership, not only here's why we have to have buy-in, here are the urgent issues, but then also what's not going to be done, and managing those expectations that there are, again, every organization I've ever been in, especially on the nonprofit space, is just taxed for time and resources. So, there's a finite amount of work in the week if you want to keep your staff. So, strategically measuring tactical problems is more of an art than a science, but there are some tools to help you do that.
Thank you. I want to get back to this question also of some places may already have a policy, but it's really outdated. Maybe they haven't updated it since people were working remotely, or since everything was in the cloud, or since the advent of AI. Is it easier, Nura, to update an existing policy, or do you recommend that they just start over, start from scratch? What's better?
Well, I think a review of the existing policy might be easier, given that they have somewhere to start from. But IT policies these days, there are several templates out there. So even if you don't have one, you can reach out to partners, vendors, uh, to get samples of templates that you can work with. But if you have an existing policy, you will need to determine whether changes have occurred in your organization. This is where the assessment comes into play. Like if you have an assessment done, you may notice the transformation in technology has happened and where your outdated policies need to change. So it needs to be rewarded, for instance, to cover the new technologies that you're currently using, or even some regulatory requirements that have come about, given the changes that the world has gone through, or your environment has gone through, or your organization needs. Um, then there's that also question about this. As you're updating this IT policy, you really want to also focus on the communication. How are you going to make sure you maintain the communication or communicate the changes to the policies to all your employees, and then provide necessary training to them. And then periodically, you need to have a way to regularly check for any compliance with the policy, and maybe addressing any issues or violations that may come about.
That's right. Like, one of the reasons you have a policy is so if an employee does something that's against what the policy says, that you have some standing there. A really great question just came in from Mary Elizabeth, who says, how do you create IT policies that allow for flexibility as IT continues to rapidly evolve, especially as Gen Z is joining the workforce? And I have a quick little anecdote on that, where I was at a conference and a bunch of people my age were sitting around saying, oh, we don't need an AI policy because we've just told people they can't use it. And I said, are you never going to hire anyone ever again? Because I guarantee every 20-year-old coming into work at your organization will be using AI for practically everything. So do you have advice, Nura or Jeff, on making policies that can be flexible? Is it just a matter of revising them often enough?
I think it is. I think it simply comes down to that. That it's not very clever, but literally putting time on a yearly or bi-yearly basis or quarterly, depending on how rampant change is in your organization. But yeah, AI, something like AI is the perfect example. If you have a timed quarterly or biannually review of certain documents, that's the best way to just block off that time. I'm talking at a very logistical level here, but with the hustle and bustle of every day and ever shifting priorities, knowing that there's a time where these 5 stakeholders get together and say, has anything changed since our last meeting, and documenting those changes. And, Nura talked about it a little bit earlier, having a section at the tail end. I started life as a tech writer, having a section at the tail end of a document with significant changes, version controls, revisions in the document, just to sort of archive those changes. And then also making sure that maybe new groups need to be involved. If you have a new department that's utilizing something like AI. And then the other thing from the IT leadership perspective is you have to have an awareness, and it's sort of schizophrenic, but you have to have an awareness of everything new going on, and imagining ways in which departments you don't oversee could potentially be sort of backdooring things like AI tools and into the environment. And also not just your policies, but updating your trainings as well, and maybe calling new training. Just that's not, if you're in a schedule of yearly, IT training that gives everybody 15 minutes and they have to take a CBT or something, that's one thing. But specialized focused training on emerging trends or changes to the workspace that you exist in, that you have to have that in your tool bag, and don't be afraid to, have a sort of training specifically associated with a significant change in the workplace.
That makes sense. I think that's another way to kind of get people's attention. If there's something new and exciting like AI, you can invite them to a meeting about it and then work in the policy as well. Here's what our rules are going to be, and here's how you can help contribute, etc. So I'm going to move on to our next poll, which is communication style. So I will read the options for you. So you could have an organization communication style that's top down, that you like to have rules to follow. You might be a more entrepreneurial or collaborative organization, like herding all the cats. It might be small team based, where you need consensus, or just your culture. Consensus is very important for you. Everybody is on the same page. It could be only you at your nonprofit. So in that case, your communication style is to yourself. Other communication styles, there's a whole bunch of other ones. I just chose some of the bigger ones. You can put that in the comments if you have a different type, or not applicable again. And I want to just say there's no judgment. Styles are styles. No one of these styles is better than the other or more effective. I think the most important thing about knowing your communication style at your organization is self-awareness. Knowing the communication style helps you communicate in ways that are effective. So following your regular process, if you're a top-down liking to have rules, then you don't want to throw that out of whack with having a collaboration and having everybody come together and put their say in. That'll really be difficult. Jeff, would you mind reading the results of the poll?
Absolutely. What's your organization's communication style? Top down, 21%, entrepreneurial, 35%, small team based, 33%. There is only me at my nonprofit, 2%, and 8% for other, and 2% for non-applicable.
Great. And we had someone did put in the chat their different styles. So a fractal messaging process, updating the higher level folks so they understand and can support their direct reports. And then we update all of the staff. That's an interesting strategy. We're moving from entrepreneurial and small team to more top down. Good luck with the change management. That can be tricky. Of course, we like rules, but herding cats is how we operate. I hear you. I see you. We're in a period of growth and looking at policies across the board. That's very clever to do that, for sure. And a combination. Yeah, I think with most people, there's a combination. And sometimes it depends on the person, right? So now we're going to move on to our next topic, which is how do you, knowing your communication style, thank you so much for sharing that with us, how do you roll out policies to new and existing staff? So we had some ideas here. You can work with HR for new hires and performance review opportunities. So I think a lot of us are familiar with, you get the HR employee handbook on the first day or the first week of work, and it has the acceptable youth policy in there and probably a bunch of other policies too, but whether or not you can absorb it at that time. So working with HR to make sure that those policies kind of are re-rolled out periodically. And then what's effective, that's how you can, especially when you're new employee, you can make sure that it's part of that new employee packet. But what's effective to roll out to existing staff, and are there tactics that work? So Nura, would you like to take the first try at this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Part of the rollout process is to initially get the stakeholders to agree on the implementation of the policy itself. Like, we have agreed that we're going to do, for instance, an acceptable use policy. We've agreed on the final version. Now it's time to roll it out. Then having a launch plan is something that an organization should have in place. That launch plan will include the roles of and outlining the roles and timetable. Also, this needs to be circulated to all the parties that are involved for agreement. Like, the role players need to know, and the timetable to actually go for lunch. Then the one key important thing is to have a communication plan. because as you've seen that a variety of organizations have different modes of communicating with their staff and different channels. So usually an organization should use the appropriate channels, messaging, to make sure that everyone that is a part of this policy has received the policy or will be receiving the policy appropriately. And there needs to be also leadership involvement, since we agreed that the stakeholder participation should include leadership. So leading by example is going to be a key kind of way to get this rollout possible. Setting positive examples for employees to demonstrate compliance with the organization, IT practices or policy. Giving those examples will show, hey, this policy could work. I can see me, complying with this policy. Not just one way, the policy, here's the policy, follow it, but kind of having a conversation about how this policy is actually helping with the mission of the organization. And then setting milestones, to communicate the IT policy, and just to make sure people are not overwhelmed. So if you put a milestone, you can basically just track all those milestones in the plan. That way, it's not too many changes at once, and making sure each policy is rolled out timely, appropriately, making sure people have the bandwidth to receive it well, and also ask questions and provide feedback. That way, you can kind of measure the success of the IT rollout policy. I know that Jeff mentioned something about, kind of leveraging trends. You can, in a way, you want to have a protocol to ensure that, you're encouraging people to follow the compliance that is outlined in the IT policy. So if there is any new advancement in technology, you want to make sure that, after a review of the policy, you go back to your communication plan. You also think of examples that you can share, so to motivate people, but maybe the adoption of a new AI acceptable use policy, for instance. So that kind of continuous improvement and continuous review, it's going to be helpful in having the rollout be successful. I would add just two more points here. One is the explaining of the importance and the significance of the IT policy, because just making sure in the communication it's thoroughly explained, that there is no chance for misinterpretation, and people understand what they are signing up for. And then lastly, I would say you want to make sure it's distributed, accessible. It's not buried in a handbook somewhere. People can have a section if you have an intranet. So many types of ways to distribute information depending on the methods that you use. Make sure it's readily available, accessible, and kind of put it in as part of your commitment to ensuring that these IT policies are clearly kind of explained to staff, either in all staff meetings periodically or referenced at least once a year, so people are aware, because they easily can get forgotten because of other priorities that the organization may have. So those are kind of the steps that would kind of summarize. But there's more to this, but I'm just summarizing the rollout of IT policies.
Thank you. There was a great comment in the chat from Michelle, who says that with IT policy changes, we roll out to the operations team first, because that team is the most tech savvy and the least change averse. So it seems like they get their champions, so the people that are going to be most excited and least frightened by the change first, and they help them work out the kinks. Once we worked out the kinks, we put together documentation and roll out to all staff. And then she says she also puts a couple of preemptive 15-minute meetings on the calendar for folks who need more assistance. So that's really, I think, smart and strategic to identify the people that will be the most resistant and give them that extra help to understand the new policy. And sometimes the new policy, really, you don't have to change anything. You have to know it, but you don't have to change what you're doing. But if there are changes that are going to have to happen, making sure that you give them that extra hand holding. Thank you, Michelle, for that comment. Jeff, do you have other examples of ways that you can roll this out? And is it different getting the attention of new staff and getting the attention of existing staff? Do you have different strategies?
I do. The one thing, back to my an earlier point that was made, is calendaring the change. This is tough for organizations, but as much sway as you can have on HR to have a yearly review with all, necessary people in that review of the employee handbook. And then the other thing I always want to consider at that level is, are there discipline specific or subject matter expertise policies that need to be reviewed and sort of acknowledged that they were reviewed? In terms of, if you have a database administrator, that's a much more buttoned up policy adherence and data handling than your average staff member is. Does the financial department need to have more training, more in-depth training on, again, financial handling, vendor management, et cetera? The policies page on an intranet is a great idea because it's all in one place. You can set a reminder to review that, and everybody knows, sort of, you get folks in the habit of going there. And then especially for new employees, when you're that first couple of days, you don't remember much from that first couple of days. So it's a place for your new employees to refer to, and they know they can look at it when they have a chance to take a breath. The one thing that I don't know how widely known it is, it's fairly common, is if you have an HRIS system, or your cyber provider may have plugins for training on certain policies, and then you can also end up negotiating. If I get 90% of my staff to review this CBT with successful passage of it, can I get some money knocked off of my cyber insurance? I've used that several times, to where they'll, if they know your staff is well trained and there are policies in place, they will give you a reduction. They won't. I'm not guaranteeing it, but at least it's a place to start negotiating. And then that CBT, if it's CBT based, you can also focus even deeper on, maybe some folks didn't do well on the CBTs. They scored under an acceptable margin. Then that's the time to target them for focused in-person training or one-on-one training, because these folks are usually in critical roles, and some of these processes and policies require 100% compliance for the success of the organization.
Can you just remind us what is CBT?
Oh, sorry, computer-based training.
Okay.
Computer-based training. Yeah, a lot of organizations will have something in their HR management system that will, or an outside third-party vendor can come in and it's a subscription, and you can kind of dictate what trainings you want. And they have canned trainings, and they have
or adaptive.
And ones that you can customize, and they're usually not, they're fairly affordable. I know money's tight everywhere, but it's a really good way to get a handle on your overall organization with some data behind it, and lets you target where you need to train or communicate better, or what departments need more specialized training.
That's great. That's great. We have some more questions coming in. So if you do have some questions, please either put them in the Q&A or right in the chat. I want to get to the barriers and make sure we have a little time to talk about this, because I feel like we've touched on some of the barriers over the course of this presentation. But Nura, would you like to talk about some of the biggest barriers to creating these governance policies?
Yeah, sure. So one of the main ones we've seen is prioritization. So oftentimes an organization, especially nonprofit organizations, are focused on their mission, and they just want to achieve their mission, and that takes priority over IT. Spending the resources and time on IT governance or IT policies. Another aspect of this is just the lack of resources, or limited resources, if we will. Many nonprofits kind of operate with limited resources, which can make it difficult to allocate sufficient time and personnel to IT policy development. Also, which, some may have a different mindset altogether, where nonprofits often focus almost exclusively on the mission and goals, which can lead to IT being overlooked and undervalued. So those are some of the, I would say, factors. Uh, but there are ways to overcome these barriers. But I want to hear from Jeff if there are more barriers that Jeff might have seen.
Mine largely are they're the exact same. Garnering that leadership buy-in and that communication of leadership buy-in. Buy-in is one thing. Having your leadership communicate to the general staff is another. And then the time. And that's yeah, I wish I had a magical response to, the time thing, but it has to be, harkening back to what we were saying earlier, you have to prioritize based on the urgent needs of the organization. And there will be times where you have to have difficult conversations with leadership and department leads and other staff that we just can't do X right now because this new situation caused us to refocus. And, another thing is, when you're communicating things like that, it's important to set a time frame and to stick to that time frame. Most folks will give you some grace if you have a date attached to something. Saying we'll get back to you, or having again, IT, the famous black box of information, that we have to change that perspective. And then one of the things that I learned every time I had a different assignment or a different job is you have to break out of the IT barrier. We'll call you if something horrible happens. Otherwise, you don't need to talk to us. We won't bother you. But IT has to be an outward facing organization and a communicative organization at that. And really speaking to, and again, these are all difficult things to do. I'm not trying to gloss over them. But, really speaking to users for their respective concerns, and what you're doing as an IT organization will help them, ease their job, secure their job, improve the success rate of whatever the discipline they're executing on. IT just generally has to get outside of being looked at as the plumber. IT has to be looked at as an enabler. And especially given how invasive technology has become, even in the last 10 years, much less 5 years, there's not many organizations or groups within an organization that aren't impacted by IT, and they have to be told, they have to be informed in how to use that IT to enable and better their mission, but also sort of the risks that are associated with these new, very powerful tools. AI is a perfect example, and the timing is critical. It's much harder to sell much harder to limit usage to non-IT teams of a new tool if it's already on their PC. You need to have that just-in-time sort of approach of policy training. Get the policy there before the tool is sitting on, the finance guy's desk who is playing around with AI, and he has no idea if it's a public LLM or a private one or whatever, or the risk to the organization is associated with just putting organizational IP out into the greater model. Again, they're tried and true, but and some of it's just diligence, is sticking with leadership, explaining to them on their level, and explaining risks of not refocusing the rest of the staff on behaviors.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in and say, I think you hit on something that I hadn't really thought about before, about IT being outward and making connections some departments or teams that wouldn't necessarily think they had an IT interest. Like one example is that the HR people, who might have their own systems that are pretty walled off usually from everybody else's, but involving them in, if there's a performance review, helping the person in that review, like explain that they understand the acceptable use policies or the new AI policy or whatever it is that has changed, and get their buy-in and collaboration. That's a really interesting tactic. We had someone in the question also ask about being able to convey the risk to leadership. So if it's something that's going along and not seen, not prioritized because it isn't seen as a huge risk, and being able to communicate that to them, which is something IT often can do, especially if they're working on the cybersecurity aspect. So I want to go ahead and move into the Q&A session. We have a couple of questions here in the Q&A. So one question is, where do we check for compliance? For me, I was thinking something you said earlier, Nura, about you have a policy, and then are the people who are under that policy complying with the policy? So if your policy is you can't use ChatGPT, how do you know that people are, and how do you manage those expectations? Do you guys have some examples or ideas?
What comes to mind are tools. There are certain security controls or technical tools that would allow for enforcement of policies. So because we're vendor agnostic, if you have an email system, you have files in the cloud, some of the cloud providers will have a governance tool, for instance, that will say that setting classification for document sensitivity, confidentiality, and a certain group of people your organization should only have access. If someone tries to delete or copy a file from one section of the file system to another, perhaps that could be a violation. Tools that are monitoring the devices that people have or have been assigned, whether they are installing third-party applications, or even some of those tools prevent from the installation of third-party applications, and even changing the configuration of the device that is issued to a staff. So there are tools that allow for the enforcement of these policies that may help with compliance tracking. And I think having the policy is one thing, and enforcement is another challenge. But at least having a policy is a good start for your organization.
Especially at nonprofits, because
Yeah.
we're very friendly, team-oriented. It can be difficult to lay down the law, basically. We have another question here about, would an IT disaster response policy normally be part of a larger organizational DR policy? Jeff, do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. It's integral. I mean, it's outside of when I've done them in the past. I mean, outside of communication, ensuring, quick, fast enablement of communication from the organization to the outside world. The DR piece is critical. I mean, what's not in your, I mean, you can't pay your people anymore. You can't, you can't find your files anymore. You can't. So I think I would almost argue that DR, controversial, but DR from an IT perspective is becoming equally as important as the rest of the organization. An organization can shut down for a day or two. If an organization loses all of its data, you're starting from scratch. If an organization can't pay its people, you're really starting from scratch, and you're going to have a myriad of other issues that are going to result from that. But absolutely.
And DR, just to clarify for
I'm sorry, I'm doing it again. Disaster recovery.
Disaster recovery. And it could be a non-hacking disaster. It could
Oh,
be
yeah.
a flood in your office that, wipes out. Although with everything in the cloud, it's less likely. Although it could be,
Yeah.
systems are down on the East Coast for 24 hours or what have you. So
plus, there is still, sorry to interrupt. There are still a frightening number of especially nonprofits that just don't have the ability to finance a move to the cloud. I see a lot of on-prem systems still. A lot of data on backed up data on large terabyte drives, things like that. It's still out there. So yeah. I think it's just a matter of, you can have a DR policy and a DR mitigation plan on a budget. It's just a matter, I mean, thinking it through, even if you have nothing to spend, thinking it through and doing tabletop exercises, doing, making sure documentation is available offline. I mean, it calls back to the old days, but that big 3-ring binder with up-to-date information, that's always going to be sitting there. You might not have access to a knowledge base that you've crafted over the decade. But a lot of the old school stuff is still out there, and it's just hard, with the cost of cloud and the cost of some of the AI tools that enable a lot of the DR stuff. But
yeah, no, We did a webinar on cyber liability insurance a couple of years ago that's still all very valid and still appropriate. And one of the things that our guest said was to have just the numbers, the phone numbers of your insurance provider and the police, because if you did suffer a malware or an encrypted, it had encrypted everything, and she had a client where the number to call the insurance provider was encrypted. They couldn't get it. So it was, very difficult for her. And she said, yeah, just that old school, a piece of paper that has those important phone numbers on it is important.
One thing to tap into, sorry, is just that your insurance providers can help and will help you create disaster recovery policies, usually included as part of the cost of your coverage. They don't want you to have a cyber incident either. It's much more expensive for them. So, they'll hook you up with auditors, resources at their disposal that won't cost you anything. And that can really help you kind of point out the weakest parts of your plan or your organization. So don't forget to leverage those.
Exactly. And we've done a couple of webinars. You can find them on our site about disaster response and how to create those plans. And as you said, Jeff, it doesn't have to be a very expensive exercise. It can be just your leadership team, figuring out who's going to do what in the event that something is inaccessible. So I'm going to leave with our last quick question. I want you each to tell me one thing that you would say to convince the board of a nonprofit of the importance of policies. So who wants to go first? And you can only say one thing. What's the most important thing to be convincing?
It's easy, but it literally can impact the continuation of the organization. The business it is a business continuity concern. You're not overstating it when you say, this could be the end of it from a financial or a data perspective.
Yeah. Nura?
I agree with Jeff, and I would add that the reputation of your organization is at stake. So having good technology policies protect your organization's data and reputation by providing clear guidance on what is acceptable, and how to manage risky situations.
Well, and I want to jump in and say that both of you are available to take more questions. So you can get in touch with both of us through our websites, buildconsulting.com for Jeff and communityit.com for Nura or myself. So I wanted to go back over our learning objectives. I hope that after this presentation, you understand the essential IT policy documentation for nonprofits and how to prioritize. We have a bunch of priorities, right? We have the acceptable use policy, and then also this disaster recovery and data retention necessities. That we hope that you have learned how to create or update these IT policies. And we shared some templates. I shared the link to our website where we have a bunch of other links to templates that you can use. Learn tactics and strategies to roll out policies to all staff. I want to thank both of our experts for sharing your experience and anecdotes and ideas on that. As you said, it's not easy. So don't worry that you haven't been able to do it, but hopefully we gave you some ideas to try. I love all of the information in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And then, of course, understanding the barriers to implementing IT governance and how to overcome those barriers. I think when we were talking about this presentation, one thing we kept coming back to was people's emotional response to the idea that they have to do this project, right? You might have an intellectual understanding that this could be the end of your nonprofit, that the risks are very real, and that you need to have these policies in place. But if you put an hour aside and you start working on it, and either you can't find your old policy, you can't find a good template, it just seems overwhelming. And you say to yourself, well, I'm not going to do that then, even though I know that I need to. So trying to overcome those kind of emotional responses and just make small changes, make it into smaller tasks that you can do that are going to lead up to your big accomplishment. I love your idea, Jeff, of putting stuff on the calendar, making time and just setting reminders. And then in the future, once you've got your policies, setting those reminders so they don't get out of control and out of date again. So just annually, quarterly, whatever works for your organization, putting that reminder on your calendar, setting those meetings and bringing the people, stakeholders back together, your leadership, to just revise them. It's so much easier to revise it and just say, oh, no, nothing's changed. We're good for another, quarter. Or, this AI is really growing and we need to incorporate that. So let's change a couple of these other things. So I think those are all such good pieces of advice. So thank you so much for all of that. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Nura and Jeff, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
We're happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.